I am an American of Cuban descent, and I want to explain to the American people why the Cuba embargo should be lifted. The President of the United States cannot lift the Cuba embargo. The embargo has to be lifted by the United States Congress. It requires a majority vote in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. I know it because that's the way that we, the Cuban Americans, designed and enforced the Cuba embargo. Hello, I'm Gabriel, and this is my grandson Dorian.
Hello.
We're here to discuss the Cuba embargo.
So Grandpa, what is the Cuban embargo?
The Cuban embargo is a collection of United States federal laws which prohibit any trade between the United States and Cuba. The embargo has been in place for approximately 55 years.
Okay, then what is the goal of the Cuban embargo?
The goal of the Cuba embargo is to bring down the Castro regime in Cuba.
Has the Cuban embargo achieved its goal of bringing down the Castro regime?
No, the Cuba embargo has been a total and absolute failure. But even worse, the Cuba embargo helps the Castro regime to retain power, because the embargo is the scapegoat of the Castro regime. Anything that goes wrong in Cuba gets blamed on the embargo.
Now, if the Cuban embargo is a failure and it's helping the Castro regime, then why is it still in place?
Because the Cuban Americans who work so hard to implement the Cuba embargo don't want to admit that it is a failure.
So what made you change your mind about the Cuban embargo?
Your father, my son, about a couple of years ago, I was visiting him, and he asked me why I was still feuding with the Cubans. Kind of took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that question, but I answered him. I told him how Che Guevara executed my uncle. My uncle's crime was to shelter an innocent fugitive. I told him about my father, an honest man, who was robbed of his business, his properties, and his money. I went on for over 5 minutes talking about all the injustices, and I concluded by saying that I wanted justice. Your dad paused for a moment, and then he said to me, "Dad, it happened 55 years ago. Who do you want justice with?"
Did you reply to him right away?
No, I was very angry. I couldn't talk. But in the next several days, after I cooled down, I knew that he was correct. But I had so much hatred in my heart that I couldn't think clearly. I just couldn't do it. So I reached out for my church. I reached out for help, and little by little, I was able to remove this wall of hatred in my heart. I was able to forgive the Castro regime. I forgive Che Guevara for the horrible thing that he did. I forgive Fidel Castro. I forgive Raul Castro. I have no more hatred in my heart. I can think clearly now.
Now that you can think logically about the embargo, what do you think should be done?
The Cuba embargo should be lifted immediately, with no conditions whatsoever on the Cuban government. The conditions that I would recommend would be on the United States government. Not a single penny of taxpayers' money should go to the Castro regime. No grants, no loans, directly or indirectly, through such organizations as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. There should be a reconciliation, but it should be a people-to-people reconciliation. If the United States corporation wants to go and invest in Cuba, they should be freely allowed to do so. If a United States citizen wants to go and invest in Cuba, they should do it. But it should be at their own risk.
Who is preventing the lifting of the embargo?
The Cuban American Lobby in the United States Congress is preventing the lifting of the embargo.
How can such a minority control the United States Cuban foreign policy?
The Cuban American Lobby is among the most powerful foreign policy lobbies in the United States Congress. We, the Cuban Americans, worked for very long and very hard to acquire that power.
So how can the embargo be repealed?
By having the Cuban American Lobby introduce legislation to lift the embargo in the United States Congress and then have a vote on it.
But you said that the United States Cuban American Lobby reflects the wishes of the Cuban American population's blinded hatred.
The Cuban American Lobby reflects the feelings of the older Cuban generations. What I call the first Cuban American generation of exiles, my father's generation, they're 100% against lifting the embargo even today. My generation, I'd say 50% want to lift the embargo, 50% want to keep it in place. Your father's generation, the third generation of Cuban Americans, are 100% for lifting the embargo.
So be specific. How do we get rid of the embargo?
First, by an information campaign to explain to the American people how the small minority of Cuban Americans are keeping in place this insane foreign policy. Second, by asking the younger generations of Cuban Americans to challenge their parents and grandparents, just like your dad challenged me. Third, by sending 1 million messages to the Cuban American Lobby demanding an end to the Cuban embargo.
So Grandpa, tell me, who do you call the Cuban American Lobby?
The next screen will show the names, the positions in the United States Congress, and the contact information for the Cuban American Lobby. I urge you to send a message to them. Demand that the Cuba embargo be lifted.
So how can people contact you?
Contact me through my blog. The next screen will show my contact information. Thank you.